So, why don't we start with a little bit of just your background? I know you grew up in Missouri. Talk a little bit about how you came to, like, what made you join the Marine Corps?
Well, I was very fortunate to get a really good high school education at Missouri Military Academy. Um, I think my folks sold their soul to send me there because I was desperate to do it. I mean, I grew up, sitting around the bar rooms with my dad, listening to the World War II veterans tell stories, and I think I just fell in love with the what I considered at the time the romance and adventure of military service. So I wanted to go to military school. I was able to do that, um, and got a really great secondary education. But my plan at the time was to go to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. And unfortunately, during my high school years, I had chased too many girls and played too much football and baseball and not enough science, technology, electronics, and mathematics. And so when I took the entrance exams, I failed it fairly miserably and was able to get another shot at it. And this was in late 1963. And I took another shot at it and fell right through my butt again. And that was it, because there was no money for college. And in those days, scholarships were not easy to get as they are today. And no grant money or anything like that. And I was just kind of lost. So the story, which is not apocryphal, by the way, goes that toward Christmas in 1963, I was kind of lost and dejected on the streets of Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And I happened to be sitting on the curb with sleet blowing and all. It's a miserable night, miserable guy. I'm sitting on the curb in Cape, and I looked up, and here's this A sign outside. I happened to be right outside the post office, and here's this A sign, and it says, it's got this rock lantern jawed Marine in dress blue uniform, and he's pointing at me, and there's one word over the top, and that one word is ready. And I looked around and I said, by God, I think I am. So the next morning, I went into the recruiting area at the post office, and I didn't bother with the Army, didn't bother with the Air Force, didn't bother with the Navy. I went right to that Marine, and I said, "Sign me up, Coach. I'm ready to go." And he was more than happy to do that at the time. So on the 4th day of January 1964, I headed for San Diego boot camp, and I guess the direct answer to your question, Mike, is that I was just at a loss, and I was dejected, and I still had those vague memories of waving flags and blowing bugles in my mind, and the Marine Corps seemed like the classic Foreign Legion, and off I went, and I'm very glad I did, by the way.
Yeah. So after you got out of boot camp, where'd you go from there?
Camp Pendleton, California. I went for infantry training,
Hmm.
and I did quite a bit of infantry training, and it turned out I was pretty good at figuring out the remote gunnery solution. So they made me an 81 millimeter mortar guy, and I frankly I enjoyed it until I got bored with it. And I've always been an observer, and always been a guy who wanted to see what's over the next side of the other side of the hill. And so I did a year or two, firing mortars and using the M16 plotting board to come up with the firing solution, and it was all trigonometry, and I got it. And so the problem was that I was bored. There was more to the Marine Corps than following the next guy up the hill with and watching his pack. And one day there was a fellow that visited our outfit, and he had a camera around his neck, and a notebook, and he was talking to people and that sort of thing. And I said, "Well, I've never seen that. Who the hell is that?" And he was a Marine. He was a Marine corporal. And so eventually I went up and talked to him, and I said, "Hey, who are you and what are you doing out here?" And he said, "Well, I'm a Marine combat correspondent." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, it's like a journalist. It's like a reporter." And I got to thinking, you know, I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and I'd always been I mean, I wish to God Annapolis would have scored my entrance exams on English literature and that sort of thing, but
Mhm.
they didn't. Um, and so I got to talking to him, and he said to me, "Look, this, what I'm doing is a very small cadre of people in the United States Marine Corps, double handful, but it is the greatest dodge in the world." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, look, we can do anything. We can just do anything. Anything the Marine Corps does, we can do. And all we've got to do is produce a little story and maybe a picture or two. But we're always there. We can go anywhere. We want to fly in a helicopter one day, we can do that. If we want to go out and march with the grunts one day, we can do that. If we want to fire artillery, we can do that." And I said, "Well, hell, that's what I've been looking for here." So I spoke with him for a while, and this is a long story, and I don't mean to bore you with it, but I spoke with him for a while, and he arranged for me to talk to some officers. Um, and the upshot was that they figured, I don't know, they gave me a little test and some other things. They figured I might make one of those guys. So off we went, and I was scheduled to go to an A school for military journalism and all that sort of thing. Never made it, because I rapidly found out that the fact that they call these guys Marine Corps combat correspondents, they do that for a reason, because they're supposed to be in combat. And so without any real schooling and very little experience, I went off to join the 1st Marine Division in, this was 1967, mid to early 1967. And off I went to join the 1st Marine Division, which was happily ensconced at that point in I Corps, up in the northern reaches of Vietnam, 1st Corps. And began my combat experience as a combat correspondent. And frankly, it was a unique look at combat, especially infantry combat. Our job essentially was to run to the sound of the guns, and you had to be up there and you had to be helping. And the infantry called us jars. Finally said, "What the hell's a jar?" And he said, "Just another rifle." I said, "Got it, okay." And in large measure, that's how it turned out to be. But it also gave me a very broad and expansive look at the war in Vietnam and the people who were fighting it. And I think one of the lessons I carried away from all of that over 20 years in uniform was that in combat, you get to see um, the absolute full gamut of human behavior. You get to see the best of humans and the worst of humans, and that's always stayed with me. That's always been one of the things I carried from my combat experience. That and a few scars, but I think what that meant was that I had a deeper and more intensive look at the war than the average guy would have got.
Yeah. I mean, I think we probably all can imagine some of the worst. I won't ask you to recount any of those gory details, but can you talk a little bit about, when you say you've also seen the best of people? Are there any examples that still stand out in your mind?
Well, you see the true meaning and this is sometimes difficult for people to assimilate, but you see the true meaning of the word love. Um, it it has so much more meaning in the human experience than just romantic love. Um, you see what is truly a band of brothers, and how that band is formed, and how that love grows. You see people from absolutely disparate backgrounds, um, the black kid from Southern Alabama and the white kid or the Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx um, come together and become, because of their relationship, become willing to really lay down their lives, really to sacrifice for the other guy. There were countless examples of that. So much more than the other end, the brutality of war. But I saw guys go up and literally, with no hope of really surviving um, the intense incoming fire, go up and grab a guy and pull him out, and he'd go down. Now you got two wounded out there, and another guy goes and pulls them both back. And you see that sort of thing regularly. And it says to me, or it poses the question to me, what the hell causes that? How can a guy do that in the face, knowing he's going to get nailed? How can a guy do that? And I saw it so many times. You see, and it's not just an adrenaline surge. There's that, of course. But you see guys doing that just because it's the right thing to do. Just because if they don't do it and nobody else does it, somebody's going to die out there. And that gives a new meaning to life and love and all that sort of thing. It took me years and years and years after the war to formulate all of this. It didn't arrive full blown in my mind. But as I began to teach, and as I began to train, and as I began to get involved, for instance, in motion pictures where I had to train actors and to try to describe that experience to them, that unique human experience to them, that's when it became solidified in my mind, so that I understood it. I guess you were looking for specific examples, but I'm just going to paint with a broad brush there, and you live with it.
I will. I'm curious about life as a combat correspondent. I mean, I would imagine that along with all of the perks, right, the ability to go anywhere and do anything that the Marines are doing, there must have been some frustrations. Um, did you find that your reporting was how am I trying to say? Did you find
Stifled
that
it.
did you find that you could report what you saw, or did you find that you had to report what people wanted to
Sure,
hear?
but yes, I could report what I saw. But look, you're thinking of it in a more civilian combat correspondent context, where they're reporting the news of. I wasn't doing that, and Marine combat correspondents were doing that. We were doing the little stories. Rudy in the rear rank with a rusty rifle, and what his life is like, and what he's done today, and what he did during this ambush, and that sort of thing. The big picture, the broader look, whether America was right, wrong, or indifferent in Southeast Asia, that wasn't our business, and we rarely ever thought about it. So there wasn't any. There were occasions where we would say something that would make the Marine Corps look bad, or we would mention weapons that were being used that the U.S. command didn't want advertised. And there were minor things like that, and they were irritating because it was just a departure from reality. Were we using beehive rounds in tanks and 106 millimeter cordless rifles? Yes. Were we dropping napalm relatively indiscriminately? Yes. And the fact that someone would say, well, we can't say that. I said, well, why the hell not? It's the truth. So there was that frustration. But in general, we weren't bothered with the ins and outs of the political aspects of the war and that sort of thing. It wasn't our business, and we frankly didn't care much about it.
So you went on to do, I believe you did 3 tours. Is that right, in Vietnam?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
But forgive me, I don't know how this works. I mean, I'm assuming that after your first tour, you had the option of not returning to Vietnam.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And some of the glitches in time has to do with medevacs, the fact that I got wounded a couple of times and had to spend time in the hospital and so on and so forth. But when it all adds up, I ended up doing about 31 months on the line. Or in and out of the line, as the case may be. And it works. The frank answer is, yeah, I wanted to stay and see this. I had found a place where I was good. I had found a place where I could survive. I had found a place where, as I said earlier, I was getting a look at absolutely the best and absolutely the worst of human behavior. I was getting a look at how the Marine Corps worked. I was getting a look at how the other services worked. And all of that was fascinating to me. And I just said, okay, well, let me just stay until they either kill me or somebody says, all right, it's over for you, and off you go.
Yeah, it strikes me that you were also getting a look at how the enemy works.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I got to know the early on the Viet Cong. And then after Tet of '68, which was a horrible time for me, I got to look at very, very up close and personal look at the North Vietnamese Army, and they were fascinating. What I could discern about them. In Tet of 1968, I fought in Hue with the 5th Marines, and that was really up close and personal, if you'll forgive the sports reference. But up until that time, a lot of the jungle fighting in I Corps that I experienced was you were shooting at fleeting shadows, or you were shooting at muzzle flashes that you'd see off in the distance. But in Hue, it was really, really, the average range would be 5 or 6 feet, and there he is, and you better shoot first. And I certainly got a look at how the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, operated, and the tenacity that they showed, and the ingenuity that they showed. And it gave me a whole new respect for that enemy out there. I mean, it wasn't Mr. Charlie, the local rice farmer by day and guerrilla fighter at night in the conical hat. That was gone. I mean, we were up against really good professional soldiers. And so the aspect of the war that I was observing began to morph. And the more things change, the more interested I become in them, because I want to master what I can. So I'd say, much like for the entire American effort in Vietnam, what changed my perspective and told me that I needed to stay in here and fight this thing to the end was the Tet Offensive of 1968. Mike, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
When did you do your final tour in Vietnam?
What's that?
When was your final tour in Vietnam, your third
Final tour, 1970. They were starting to pull the Marines out at that point. They were decreasing the size of the Marine Corps commitment to Vietnam. And I had been wounded again. And they said, well, maybe what you want is not important. It's what we want, and we want you out of there. So I think it was May or June of 1970 was my last gasp.
I haven't talked to anybody before who's spent that much time in Vietnam during the war. I wonder, how did you think about it differently as you were leaving? Like, how did your perception of that war differ from between the third tour and the first tour?
I'd have to say it matured. I began to realize that we weren't really in it to win it. That we wanted to turn it over to the South Vietnamese, and that's a great idea, and I thought was really what we were going to do in the first place, or what we were bound to do when we went in. But we had, because of the nature of how we fought the war, where we kept flooding more and more units, more and more divisions into the war, rather than enable and embolden the South Vietnamese. It was easier for them to say, well, hell, let the Americans do it. And we did, rather than saying, no, it's your job, you get out there and do it. And I began to see that happening, even above and beyond the Nixon Vietnamization thing. That wasn't working, and I could see it wasn't working. So we had not built both a military and a political infrastructure that would allow them to march off on their own. They could do that, but they needed support. And our Congress was unwilling to give that support. And so the House of Cards collapsed. But I could see that coming. I mean, I didn't know specifically how it was going to act out and how it was going to end up. But I said, this is not going to end well. We are not going to get to where we wanted to in the original commitment back in 1964, 65, that sort of thing. And so I knew that. I knew that this was not going to end well. I didn't know how badly it was going to end. But I knew that we were destined not to do what it was we initially intended to do. And so when I left, I was a bit disillusioned. And the funny part was that I was not at all disillusioned with the performance of the American soldier on the ground. That was magnificent. And I knew that from firsthand personal observation, how magnificent that was. Sure, we had our buttholes, and we had people who were, should never have been in uniform in the first place. And we had people who just couldn't adapt to the combat situation. But for the most part, the vast majority were wonderfully dedicated people who were willing to do whatever it took. They weren't fighting for a great cause. I'm sure you've heard this before. They were fighting for the guy on their left and the guy on their right. But in so doing, in my view, they were as good as anything we saw. The stories that I heard from the guys in the bars from returning from World War II, same deal. Same sort of guys, same sort of toughness, same sort of willingness to go and do, despite terrible adversity and danger. They were willing to go and do it. And so I knew that the failure, if there was bound to be one, wouldn't be down to the individual soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine on the ground. It would be a lack of political will. Now, there are a lot of people who, I watched the media very closely. In those days, we actually read newspapers. And I watched that very closely. And I said, where the people who are writing this stuff aren't seeing what I'm seeing. The vast majority of them aren't seeing what I'm seeing. They're looking at the broad strokes. They're looking at America's commitment to Southeast Asia, and they're looking at political corruption on the part of the Saigon government and all that sort of thing. I didn't know much about that. Didn't know much about that other than what was being reported. But it occurred to me that the minds of way too many Americans were being changed, were being altered. The perception of way too many Americans about the American commitment in Vietnam was being altered by this. That's not to say, and I'm not the kind of guy who says, oh, the press lost it for us in Vietnam. Oh, that's a myth and that's nonsense. But they certainly were influencers. And I think the war, the 10 years that we were at war in Southeast Asia, just wore America out. The public got tired of it. Just got, is there never any end? And I immediately, when I observe what happened in Afghanistan, I say, Jesus, there it is. We're doing it again. Is there never an end to this sort of thing? And I think the same thing happened among the American population. They just got tired of it. And when a politician senses that the public isn't supporting his position, he changes that position. And I think that's precisely what happened in Vietnam.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know. I think for most people, at least most of the people I know, there's a limited appetite for carnage, but most people will support it if it seems like the cause is just and it seems like we have a clear plan. Basically, the Powell doctrine, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
think people can get behind warfare, under certain circumstances, but when it just goes on and on and on, and it feels like you're just feeding young men into a meat grinder, it just doesn't,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
The public will support that. You're right, Michael. But there's a ticking clock. I mean, the American public will put up with damn near anything for a limited amount of time. And then it's not bored, it's just frustrated. And when they get frustrated, support falls away. And that's a very easy thing to see. They just don't care anymore. I've seen it all, I've done it, and that's terrible for families who've sent those young men into that meat grinder and so on and so forth. But it is the nature of our American beast, and we saw it in Southeast Asia, and we saw it again in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So after 3 tours in Vietnam, you went on to complete a 20-year career in the Marine Corps. When you
Yeah.
when you came home from Vietnam, did you have a plan for the rest of your Marine Corps career, or did it just
No,
unfold?
the Marine Corps had a plan for me, but I guess I should say a word here about homecoming, if you will. Um, I had been a long time in combat, and I was suffering from some mental aberrations about it. Psychological aberrations is a better way to say it. Today, what we call PTSD, which is a terrible word, we ought to get rid of it in the language. It's not a disorder, but I digress. And the good news is, I mean, frankly, when I got home, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation unless you were in uniform. I didn't have any time for you. And the good news was that I was able to sort of hide in the Marine Corps. It was easy to live on a Marine Corps base and not ever go outside the gate if you didn't want to. And that's kind of what I did. But I think I was able to sublimate it to some extent. And the good news, or the solution in my case, the remedy in my case, was I began to write, and I began to write seriously. And I began to write about what I had experienced, with no thought of doing that for the Marine Corps. I was doing it for me and for my experience, and it was cathartic. It really was. And after a couple of years, I mean, I had my first book published, a book called Run Between the Raindrops, about the Tet Offensive of 1968, the Battle in Hue. And it was cathartic. And I said, I can get over this. I can handle this. I can talk to civilians without choking the life out of them. And so I was able to kind of recover. And the Marine Corps at that point, I had been decorated and considered to be a relatively combat experienced guy. And the Marine Corps at that point, under a commandant by the name of Lou Wilson, a World War II Medal of Honor recipient, decided that we were going to clean up the Marine Corps. There was way too much trash and crap that had come along in the Vietnam years, and the turbulence that constant rotation into and out of Southeast Asia had caused. And he was going to get us back to roots. We were going to get back to being America's force in readiness, and being those guys who still get their hair cut, still stand at attention, and still say yes or no, sir, and carry out their orders. And to do that, in General Wilson's view, what we had to do was take good, solid combat leaders, enlisted men. And I think at this point I was a gunnery sergeant. And we need to commission them. And we need to use those Mustang officers to get out there and get us back to the roots and restore discipline and all that sort of thing. So I got policed up, and I wasn't really ready for this because I didn't have a college degree at the time. I was going to night school and trying to get a college degree, but I didn't have one.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask a clarifying question. It sound was the issue from his point of view a lack of respect among the enlisted men for the officer corps, and so they wanted to sort of bridge the gap with these Mustangs?
I'm sure there was some of that, Michael. But but frankly, I think what it was he had seen way too many incidents of indiscipline,
Hmm.
and the Marine Corps is founded on discipline.
Hmm.
Lack of respect, sloppiness, inattention to the detail that indicates discipline. And he wanted that squared away, and he wanted it squared away post haste. And so he thought the way to do it was to take these staff NCOs, senior NCOs, and to the extent that they were qualified and were willing to commission them and get them out in there, so that the indiscipline that couldn't be handled by young second lieutenants straight out of Quantico and so on and so forth could be handled by these old salts, you know, who knew where the bodies were buried and knew how to handle this sort of thing, and would deal with it in no uncertain terms. So that was part of his plan. And I kind of got policed up in that. And I think I said I think I was a master sergeant at the time. So I was just one step from the highest enlisted rank there could be. But he and several of my other officers wanted me to go to Quantico, wanted me to become an officer. They said, that's the future. That's where you belong. And I got to think about it. I said, well, I guess. And it would indeed, maybe if I were to do that, I could get myself into an opportunity to pass along my experiences and what I knew about leadership in extremis and in peacetime. And so I volunteered to do it, but I couldn't go directly to commissioned officer because of the requirement for a college degree. So I ended up becoming a warrant officer. And I was a warrant officer for a couple of years. Great rank in the Marine Corps. And I was able to train and influence a bunch of young Marines that I think are better off for it. And then eventually, I was able to, I got my college degree in English literature, of all things, and was able to then convert my commission from warrant to a regular. I never became a second lieutenant. I went directly from chief warrant officer to first lieutenant.
I see. And I mean, you must have, on some level, you must have found the work satisfying, right? You didn't have to stay 20 years.
No, it was tremendously satisfying. And I began to really become a good trainer and a good leader and a good teacher. And I say that with, I hopefully due humility, but I was good at it. Young men and women would listen to what I had to say because I could say it in an entertaining fashion. I was a storyteller, and they would pick up, and I would see that happen. I would see their lives change, usually for the better, and that was enormously rewarding to me. So I was willing to hang around for as long as they would let me, and then I was a captain at the 2nd Marine Division in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, when we made our commitment to Beirut, Lebanon, in the multinational force. And I went with the American contingent of the multinational force, which was Italians, Frenchmen, and Americans. And I was over there quite a while, but it was a loser, and I could see it coming. Everybody could see it coming. We supposedly were to be a neutral peacekeeping force, just keeping the opposing sides away from killing each other. Well, that wasn't working. And the longer we stayed and the more things we tried to do that a normal military outfit would do, the more we began to be perceived by the warring factions, the Druze in the Lebanon Mountains, the anti-Lebanon Mountains, and several of the full alphabet factions that were running around the city blowing things up. The more we tried to help, the more we were perceived as taking one side or another. We were perceived as taking the Israeli side, and so we started to get incoming fire, rockets from the Druze up in the mountains, and mortars, heavy mortars, and artillery, and and I said, well, here it comes. We should cut and run out of this. We should get out of this, because if we don't, and if we continue to be deployed to Beirut, Lebanon, under enormously stupid restrictions, rules of engagement, essentially, no magazine in the weapon for a while, and then magazine in the weapon, but no round in the chamber, and all that. So that, as a combat veteran, I knew that's nonsense. That's stupid. That's asking to get somebody killed. And in October of 1983, we got a lot of people killed. We got 241 killed in a barracks bombing. Now, I wasn't there for the actual bombing. I had rotated home a couple of months earlier, but I knew all those guys in the battalion landing team headquarters, and a lot of them were very close friends. And the truth of the matter is, it sort of broke my warrior's heart. I said, you know, we did this to ourselves. We did this by being stupid. We did this by ignoring the reality on the ground. We did it out of ignorance. And while I knew from my own experience on the ground that the Marines who were there were complaining about it. We're saying, you know, we're asking for it here. It's coming. We got to fix this. We got to do something about it. But we were under a sort of a dual chain of command. We were responding to the State Department for diplomatic international relation elements, and we were responding to the Marine Corps, to the military, for the others. And it was just a zoo. It was a mess. And it was a disaster looking to happen, and it did. In October of 1983. So when that happened, I said, you know, if I'm in a situation where I can no longer look a young Marine in his or her beady ass eyeballs and say, follow me, it is necessary that we die. If I reach that point, it's time to quit. And so I did. I had enough years in to retire with a pension. And I did that. I said, you know, I just need to not be associated with that anymore, because I would be a weak leader. I would be a weak teacher. You've got to be motivated. You have to believe what you're selling. You have to believe in it. And at that point, I was losing a lot of that motivation. And so I said, rather than spread that crap around, let me just back away and leave it to younger men and women, which I did.
I have to say that is a tremendous example of self-awareness. You know, I wish more leaders knew when it was time to.
So do I. Yeah.
And not, you know, I mean, my experience is strictly, you know, civilian, but I've seen a lot of people stick around longer than they should have.
Yeah. And it shows, and it tells, and it vastly influences their decision making. You know, they become careerists, as opposed to professionals, and that just sticks horribly in my craw. So I'm glad you recognize.
And it also creates a toxic culture. I mean, there's no way around it. You know, once somebody's become a careerist and their objectives are entirely self-serving, there's no way for the culture not to turn toxic. So it's amazing that you stepped away. So what year was that you was that 83?
1984.
84. And you founded Warriors Inc. the same year?
I think it was 85. I think it was the next year.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about that year between walking away from the Marine Corps and founding Warriors Inc. What's going on in your mind?
I'm not sure. There was a mind. But I went to work for an outfit in Colorado by the name of Soldier of Fortune magazine.
Okay.
And I thought it was kind of a perfect fit because it had a military bent, and it it was a chance to exercise my literary chops and, be an editor and write stories and that sort of thing. But it kind of turned out to be a go to Central America or the Middle East and train guerrilla forces, and then if you survive, write a story about it. And I did that for a little while, and I said, well, this isn't what I'm cut out to do. The literary part of it is terrific, but I'm a fish out of water here. So I had words and parted with the Soldier of Fortune outfit. Now I was really lost. I didn't know what the hell to do. Where am I going? It would be admitting defeat if I tried to get back in the Marine Corps. So I said, there's got to be something. And I had this plan sort of cooking in the back of my head. I'd always been a movie fan. I think I'd seen every military movie there was. And in large measure, the common denominator was most of them pissed me off because they just, like a lot of veterans, it wasn't, they just weren't reflective of the life we lived and who we were and how we treated each other and that sort of thing. So I said, well, who does that? And I would watch the credits, and eventually I'd see somewhere buried in the credits would be, Colonel Freddie Umpty-Frats, U.S. Army retired military technical advisor. And I said, well, what the hell is that about? Don't they listen to him, or doesn't he know, or what's the deal? So I said, and the truth is, you can do a lot of things that people tell you can't do when you're ignorant. And God, was I ignorant about how movies are made and that sort of thing. But I had this idea that if I founded an outfit that sold its services as military advisors to the movie, and I stayed away from the word technical, because here was my theory in brief, was that every veteran has been to a military movie and seen the ribbons on the wrong side, or the beret that looks like a pizza plate on top of his head, and those are the superficial things that piss us all off, and they pissed me off. But I thought there was something more important missing. I thought there was a lack of understanding, or a shallowness of understanding on the part of the actors I was seeing portraying us. In my view, they didn't get us. They didn't know who we were, how we thought, how we responded to each other, how we contacted with each other. All of that dark humor that we use to buoy our spirits in bad situations. Didn't understand any of that. They were just up there spouting, spouting speeches that somebody had written for them that sounded patriotic or sounded gruff and combatish. And I said, well, that's nonsense. Somebody needs to train those people. And you know what? I'm terrific at training. So, and I have the experience and the background to go with it. So what I'll do is I'll form an outfit here, and I'll call it Warriors Incorporated. And I'll go out there and I'll try to sell my services to the motion picture industry. Well, the motion picture industry wasn't at all interested in that sort of thing from me, because I had this radical new idea that I was going to take these actors out and make them miserable and reduce them to the lowest common denominator, and then build on that knowledge and insight about military service and military people. So the response I got generally was, look, kid, we've been making military movies for 3 decades. And we've done just fine. We've made gazillions of dollars doing it our way. Who needs your crapola? And you want to just punish our pampered movie actors? No, I don't think so. So I was really kind of in a bad spot. I was just about to give up. I'd been out there about a year. Just beat everybody up, trying to get just one person to understand the concept that I had in mind. Not much luck. My full immersion Captain Stanislavski method was not meeting with great receptiveness. And so I had one of the things I had learned to do was to read the trade papers, Daily Variety and that sort of thing. And so I was just on the verge of saying, okay, I got to go get a job. And I had the application form for the McDonald's assistant manager position all filled out. I was ready.
Really?
But I'm about ready to give it up. And I noticed this little notice in Daily Variety.
Captain Dye?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to ask you to go back. There was a little glitch in the signal there.
Okay.
Can you go back to you had the application for McDonald's assistant manager all filled out. And you saw something in one of the trades.
Yeah. So I was really about to give it all up. It just didn't seem to, my dream or my wild ass vision, if you will, just wasn't meeting with much reception in the established Hollywood. And so, I was really at odds ends. I'd had the application form for McDonald's assistant manager position all filled out on my desk. And I was just about to say, okay, that's it. I gotta give it up. And I had learned to read the trade papers. I'd learned to read Drama Log and the Daily Variety and that sort of thing. And I was paging through Daily Variety. And I saw this little notice in a column written by a guy named Army Archard. I think he's dead now, but he was a Hollywood sort of gossip reporter and that sort of thing. And it said that a heretofore relatively unknown writer-director by the name of Oliver Stone was going to do a Vietnam War picture based on his own experience as a combat infantryman in Vietnam. And I said, Christ, if I can get to this guy, if anybody's going to understand what I want to do, he will understand what I want to do. So through some machinations I can't really tell you about because the statute of limitations may not have run out yet, I managed to get 5 minutes with Oliver Stone, and I pitched it what I thought was wrong with previous war movies and how by applying my method we could fix it with his war movie. And we kind of sniffed each other like strange dogs, for a while. And I think he finally got the idea. He asked me a few questions, and I answered about my experiences in Vietnam. And I think he was either desperate or he actually got what I was trying to tell him. I'm still not sure to this day, but Oliver he decided, okay, I'm going to give this guy a shot. And he gave me 33 actors to take for 3 weeks into the mountains of the Philippine jungle and train them. And what he said was, when you bring them out of here, if they aren't what you and I were at 19, if they don't look like it, they don't talk like it, and they don't act like it, you're fired. And I said, okay, I got it. So off I went, doing it my way for the first time. And we had guys like that now are big names that weren't then. We had Forrest Whitaker, Johnny Depp, Tom Berenger, Charlie Sheen, Johnny C. O'Reilly, and on and on and on. But I wore them out. I wore them out and made them made them dig their own hole and live in it. And they did that for 3 weeks. And when we brought them down out of there, Oliver looked at me and his eyebrows went up, and I said, I told you, that's us. And he said, yeah, it is. So we made this little movie called Platoon and brought it home. We only had $5 million all in to make that thing. And we brought it home. He was very good he knew that I had trained those people and that they would respond to me as their company commander. And in fact, he cast me as the company commander in the movie. But the point of it all is that we brought that little movie home, and it promptly won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Oliver. And he was very gracious in recognizing me publicly, both in the credits and at the Academy Awards, for my contribution to the success of that movie. And nothing succeeds like success in Hollywood, as you probably know. And so all those people who were throwing me out of their offices and everything, now the phone was ringing and everybody wanted me to work on their film and to recreate what I did with Platoon. And that was the beginning of the Warriors Incorporated legacy, if you will.
Yeah. And how many, so that's not a bad start, right? Your first gig in Hollywood is
Yeah.
Platoon, right? That's um how many films did you go on to do with Warriors Inc.?
I think if you include miniseries and television programs, uh, feature films, and if you include my work both behind camera and in front of camera, it turns out to be about 51. I think that was the last count, 51 or 52.
Wow. I just can't imagine. I mean, I know that you went to California with sort of that vision in mind, but you must have been surprised at the scale of your success.
I was surprised after Platoon. I mean, I knew that what I perceived was even if this does well, and there was no reason for me to think it necessarily would, other than it was a great film. But how was the public going to react to that? You know, I didn't have any idea. Maybe it's a one-off. You know, maybe I'm dreaming too big here. I'm getting above my raisins. But what I found, which was an extraordinary development, when Platoon became so popular nationwide, worldwide, I began to get invitations along with Oliver and some of the cast members to appear on things like Good Morning America and the Oprah Winfrey Show, and the audience for those, interestingly, was veterans, Vietnam veterans, guys who had kept their entire experience in Vietnam in the closet, if you will, who wouldn't talk about it, you know, didn't want to talk about it because nobody could understand, and so on and so forth. And suddenly we do this film that admittedly is not the end all and be all of everybody's Vietnam experience. I mean, ask any veteran. It depends on where you were, what year you were there, what service you were in. It can be two different wars. If you have a guy who was there in 65 and a guy who was there in 69, an Air Force guy talking to a Marine, it seems like two different wars from their experience. But what I found was that there was enough commonality. There was enough, look, this may not be exactly my experience, you know, as a soldier in Saigon, or my experience as an airman at Tan Son Nhut, or my experience as a Marine in I Corps. But there's enough commonality there that I can take my wife, my parents, and say, look, I didn't really want to talk about Vietnam. It's nobody understands. But if you watch this, maybe you'll get a little look of what that war was and what it did to us. And so I observed that, and I said, well, maybe I have helped do something here that is larger than just a piece of entertainment. Maybe this is something that our veteran community needed at that time. And I think that's right. I think we brought out something that America's Vietnam veterans could point to and say, look, it may not be my story. There may be some stuff in there I don't agree with. But there's enough detail, nuance, and atmosphere and psychology about the relationship between individual soldiers. There's enough of that in there that you can understand something of why this was such a seminal experience for me in Vietnam. And so it occurred to me, it surprised me, I'll grant you, it certainly did. But it occurred to me that I may have a tiger by the tail here. And if I do it right, if I continue a dedication to getting it right, if I continue a dedication to teaching and monitoring performances that will connect with audiences, veteran audiences and non-veteran audiences, then maybe I can have a big influence. And look, I was smart enough to know that the popular media, hence you and I talking to each other here, is a huge influencer these days. And so if I were to work in that medium, maybe I could make a difference. Mm-hmm. And here it was. And then I began to expand. This is more than you asked me, but it's your dime, so sit there. Okay. But then I began to expand. I began to get opportunities to work on video games. I began to get opportunities to work on music videos, all military related in some fashion or another. I began to do talk radio in Los Angeles. And more and more, I expanded the whole Warriors concept and sort of honed the mission. I've always said the Warriors mission, if somebody needed me to articulate it, the Warriors mission was simply to shed some well-deserved and long overdue positive light on the men and women who've worn our military uniform. That sounds cliche, but I really mean it. And so I took every opportunity to do that. And the more my name became known and the more my work became known, both in front of and behind the cameras, the more opportunity I had to do that. And so I expanded. We did theme live entertainment shows and theme parks and all sorts of things. So I would do practically anything as long as I could see a connection to the overall Warriors agenda.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I can't even remember what you asked me, but I guess that's enough.
I asked you if you were surprised by the scale of your success, and
yes,
yeah, and yeah, I'm glad that you gave such a thorough answer, because I did not realize that you had worked on video games. I am not a video game guy. That's not
neither
my
am I.
bag. But I know a lot of people who are. I have a son who I'm not too sure he's into it anymore, but for a while there he was very into it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
his favorite video games were Halo 3 and Call of Duty. I mean, here's this kid who had no ambitions of going in the military. I tried to get him to. I thought it was actually a great path for him. He rejected that, but he spent all his spare time pretending to be
Yeah.
a military person.
But as long as it brought him some understanding, I think it's fine.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to go back a second, because I'm trying to picture, you know, Johnny Depp and John C. Reilly and Charlie Sheen digging holes in the ground and living in them while you stand over them and, you know, and
Oh, they did.
and shape them. I would assume that there's a certain kind of actor who's grateful for that experience, and there's another kind of actor maybe who feels less grateful for the experience.
Yeah.
What kinds of, I'm not looking for you to name names, but what kinds of, you know, what was the range of reactions, not just on Platoon, but over the course of your career with Warriors? What have you seen from actors?
It's easy to say. What you have is real actors, real storytellers, people who are relatively selflessly interested in supporting a story that they've taken an interest in. And they understand that their performance is part of telling that story. The more effectively they do that, the better off everybody is. That's an actor. And then you have a movie star. And then you have people who are in it completely selfishly, who are in it for accolades, constant ego massage, make as much money as they can, be as high profile as they can, and cater to adoring masses. That guy doesn't do well. Now, I've had a few of those, and I've been fortunate to, through the experience that I put them through, to get them to see beyond it, to get them to see that there is something more important than their role and how many lines do I have and how's my hair look. I mean, it's more difficult sometimes than others. But for the most part, because of the films that I do, have a tendency to be group stories, team stories, platoons, companies, squads doing this, that, and the other sort of thing. It's easy for them to understand the interdependence and the relationship because I force it on them. They have to rely on that guy, or they're going to have to, dig that hole all by themselves, and they're not going to be happy with that. So I have encountered both types. I love the real actor type. He's the guy I want. He's the guy I can teach. He's the guy who will get enough from it to make the story so much more effective through his performance, through his narrative. I'd rather not have the other guys. I have had a bunch of them. And the good news is I've been able to change their viewpoint, at least for the duration of a particular project.
I feel like you just gave the pitch for Tropic Thunder.
Tropic Thunder was my executive officer is a guy by the name of Mike Stokey. And he's been the executive officer for Warriors almost since we finalized that. I had to drag him kicking and screaming into my scheme, but he's been with me ever since, and he's done all of the big ones. And he's a Captain Die advocate. He knows exactly how to do this sort of thing. And Mike is the one who went to Hawaii to do Tropic Thunder. And I had a little bit of, I helped him a little bit, that sort of thing. But he was really the point man in Tropic Thunder. And when I saw it, I was the one who negotiated with Jerry Stiller to actually do it, and then assigned Mike to it. And he had a great time over there, and I loved it. I mean, when I finally saw it, I had read the script and so on and so forth. But I figured, how are they going to do this? And then, they had such tremendous actors in the thing. Jesus, it's hard to screw that up. And then they had this great sense of humor, and I love comedies. I love laughing at myself and laughing at anybody else that I can manage to laugh at. And when I saw it, I called Mike immediately and I said, "Jesus, brilliant! It's absolutely brilliant. I love it." And he said, "Well, I didn't know how you'd feel." I said, "Absolutely great. It's a parody of what we do in large measure." He said, "Yeah, I know that." But I knew some of the actors, and so I knew they were going to deliver, and they did.
Yeah, and how? That's what I mean. I'm not most Hollywood comedies, kind of fall apart in the third act.
Yeah,
but
yeah, they do.
That's one of my favorites. There's so many great little moments in that.
Oh,
in that.
brilliant.
And then the archetypes that you're talking about, the actor who really wants to support the story versus the movie star who just wants to sell, his late, and then you've got the rapper, who's
it was all there.
Cola. It's amazing. It's
and Stiller, when we first started negotiating to do it, and he let me read the script, I said, "Boy, you're hitting everybody right on the head here." And he said, we started talking about actor types, and I said, "Man, I've had him, I've trained him." And he said, "That's what this is about." So he perceived all of this when they were writing it. I mean, he knew that was coming. Yeah.
And Nick Nolte in that
Oh,
role.
Nick was, and I had known Nick. I'd helped train him for Thin Red Line, and so I knew Nick. And I said, "Oh my God, is he going to try to do Captain Die in this thing?" And he didn't really. Nick brought his own stuff. He always does.
Yeah.
But it was funny to watch it.
Yeah. I don't know what you call it. I only know the sound it makes when it takes a man's life. Hilarious, right?
It's great.
Yeah. I don't want to spoil it for people, but that's a. So let's. What are some of the projects you've worked on that you're most proud of, and why?
Well, I'll always be very proud of Platoon, for the reasons I told you earlier. I think it taught me that A, my method works, and B, it allowed me to sort of hone and refine how I use my method, and C, it convinced me that what I'm doing, if I do it right, can have an influence beyond entertainment in a motion picture or a television show. So Platoon's always going to be close to my heart because it was, it launched my career, if you will. But I'm very, very proud of Band of Brothers, the miniseries.
I have to say that is the most incredible television I have ever seen.
Thank you. And my performance as Colonel Sink in that, and the weeks I spent training the actors and all that sort of thing. In fact, I walk into the little pubs here in Lockhart, Texas. And everybody said, "Hey, Colonel Sink." And, so that's one of those roles that kind of lives in perpetuity.
Yeah,
so
I own the box set.
Yeah, well, good.
Box set, and it's it's not because my father was a soldier. He was 20 years in the Army, and I grew up a military brat. But I don't think it's that. I don't think it's necessarily nostalgia for my military brat days. I think it really is. It's just some of the best storytelling I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and I'm very proud of it. And I'm also proud, although it's a little different feeling and a little different level of success, of the Pacific, which was the follow-on to that. So that stands out of my mind. I'm very proud of Born on the 4th of July, which started a long ongoing relationship with Tom Cruise that I have. And I'm very proud.
I'm ashamed to say that I haven't seen that yet.
Well, what are you, a communist? Get out there and buy that thing.
I just had a hard time. I think when it came out, Tom Cruise was, I just felt like I wasn't going to believe him in that role.
Yeah.
So I never saw it. Now, all these.
You kept seeing him in Risky Business.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
You should see it. It's a good film.
I will.
And I'm very proud of Saving Private Ryan. Which was an extraordinary experience and the beginning of a long relationship with Spielberg and Tom Hanks. So I guess if you forced me to narrow it down, I'd probably include those.
Well, I'm a little concerned with you stepping away from the business, that we're doomed for all future movies depicting the military to be terrible.
Well, that gives me way too much credit. Look, I think my success has influenced others. There are some guys and gals out there that want to be Captain Die 2 or 2.0 or 1 point, whatever the hell it is. You get the analogy. And that's okay. But too many of them don't get how much work and research there is involved. I did 2 deployments to Iraq and I did 3 to Afghanistan. Therefore, I can be a movie technical advisor. No. What about if the movie's about the Navy? What about if the movie's about the Air Force? What about if the movie uses weapons from a historical period you weren't in uniform for? How do you handle that? How do you do that? How do you write a training schedule for a 256-man Greek phalanx, as I did in Alexander? You've got to be able to do those things. And most of the young men and women who say they want to do what I do don't get it, and sometimes they'll get one movie and they'll do a great job and then nothing, because they don't know that, you got to expand your horizons and broaden your field and your field of expertise. So here's the direct answer to your question. I may be backing off, although I'm still going out in November to help do a new film, but I may be backing off a bit. But I think there are people in the wings, if you will, who have observed enough of what I've done and heard enough about what I've done and the way I do it, that they can step up and develop their own methodology. As long as the means support the same end, you won't be left out in the cold for military movies. And more importantly, the mission will continue of giving audiences an insight into who we are, what we are, and why we are.
Well, just privately between you and me, and this won't go. This will. I'll make sure this gets edited out of the file. But I just saw the new Top Gun film.
Did you?
I was not a fan of the first one, and it didn't gel with any experience I'd ever had with military men. Those characters were completely unbelievable to me. The dialogue was awful. Um, and then there were the little things like haircuts that were wrong, and but I thought, okay, it's been decades, right? Tom Cruise is nearly 60 now. He's a much more interesting man than he was when he made Top Gun.
Yeah.
His character would also have to be a much more interesting man than he was in the first Top Gun. And Hollywood is generally making better movies now than they were when they made Top Gun. So I
Yep.
took my son, we went to see Top Gun, and man, I rolled my eyes the entire movie. It was just like the first one, but cheesier, if that was possible. I mean, the action sequences were cool. Like I loved all the flight sequences, but and the story wasn't terrible. But I just, man, I just don't. I feel like that was such a missed opportunity.
Yeah, it was. In fact, most of the naval aviators, I call them nasal radiators, that I know, and I know a lot of them, have been ringing my phone to death. They just saw it, and they interestingly, they kind of had the same reaction. They said, "Look, we hope this is a huge hit," and it is. It's a mega hit box office wise,
Yep.
and it has some influence on recruiting and so on. That kind of thing. Uh, but they had the same eye rolling thing. They said, every time they get off the flight deck or out of an airplane, we're into B story mishmash, and it isn't, it's vastly hyperbolized and over dramatized, and frankly, I agree. I know from an insider perspective what they're doing. I just think there was a better way to do it.
Yeah.
And frankly, I got to lay that down to Tom, because you don't direct Tom Cruise these days. You just kind of let him go and pay for what he wants.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, he's absolutely earned the right to make whatever movie he wants, and I don't. I'm really happy that he's successful. I just was disappointed in the film because I thought Top Gun could have been a good film, and I thought
Yeah,
this was his chance to make Top Gun a good film,
yeah.
and he didn't. So, or at least not, to my taste, right? I mean, you can't watch Band of Brothers and then watch Top Gun and think that you're talking about the
No,
same kind of men.
there's a disconnect there. Yeah.
Right, right, exactly. You mentioned effects on recruiting. That's something I had not considered. Can you talk a little bit more about, over the course of your career with Warriors, or just as an observer of film, of the industry, have you seen, you know, big spikes and uh, really dramatic valleys? I mean, does anybody who measures that? Who looks at
I'm
recruiting
used.
trends in the wake of the release of a new picture?
There probably is somebody that does that. I mean, you know, there's always somebody who compiles statistics like that. I don't have access to them, but I can tell you this. Um, After films like Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and Saving Private Ryan, I can't tell you. I travel around the country talking to military audiences, and for some reason they still want to hear my crapola, but I can't tell you how many times guys will come up to me at some place like Saint-Mary Glace in Normandy, or at Fort Bragg, and just say, I joined the Army because I saw Band of Brothers, and I hear that regularly, and 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 that those are anecdotal, I understand, uh, but there's so many of them that it's got. I have to be, if we get it really right. Somehow I feel like there is an influence.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if your Wikipedia page is accurate. I don't know who maintains that, but you sort of joined the Marines, according to Wikipedia. You joined the Marines because you heard a story from a Marine who had fought in the Pacific Theater. You heard a story about man-to-man fighting, and that made you interested in becoming a Marine.
I'm not sure where that came from. It probably came from some interview like this one, where, but I can remember saying that I used to, and I think I mentioned it briefly with you. I used to sit in neighborhood bars with my dad, listen to these guys tell stories, and I remember there was a fella, probably had too much beer and certainly too much combat, but he'd been a Marine on Peleliu, and he told this story, and the drunker he got, the more he embellished, but I'm sure. But knowing what combat was like on Peleliu, it can't have been too exaggerated. But he talked about hand-to-hand combat, and looking in another guy's beady ass eyeballs and killing him. And that stayed with me. I guess as a kid, I was thrilled by it, in the gory way that kids think of things like that. Oh man, I wonder if I'd be good enough to do that. I'm sure that sort of stayed in my mind, and that's probably what the Wikipedia thing. I don't pay much attention to that, but that's probably what they're talking about.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that a motion picture can affect recruiting, because young men have always heard stories
Sure.
that
Yeah.
that inspired them to go and do great
Test
things or not great
themselves.
things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember reading The Perfect Storm when it first came out. Again, hated the film, but the book is fantastic. It's one of the best pieces of long form reporting I think I've ever read. I mean, Sebastian Junger is a tremendous writer. But I remember reading in that book about pararescue jumpers, and I had never heard of PJs before. I didn't know anything about PJs and the training they go through, and guys come there from airborne rangers and Green Berets, and when they fail out, they go back to being airborne rangers and Green Berets. Like, holy cow! Navy SEALs, go to PJ school, and when they fail out, they go back to being Navy SEALs. Like, that is astounding to me.
That's a pretty high bar. Yeah.
And the first thing I thought about was, is it too late for me? I think I was probably close to 30 by then.
Yeah.
And I just thought, is it too late? Is it too late? Can I go do that?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So that's, stories, that's really all we are at the end of the day. I mean, we're 99.6% identical to chimpanzees. So how different can we be from each other than our stories?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, this has been an awful lot of fun, and I really appreciate how generous you've been with your time and your energy. Is there anything I didn't ask you, Dale, that you think I should have, or anything you'd like to cover, just in terms of your...
I would like to say that my quest to tell the military story, which I've done in all sorts of media now, continues with my books. I mean, my wife and I had formed a company called Warriors Publishing Group, and we publish stories written by veterans, and we've had enormous success with that. We've got a great list of authors. We even have the reprints of John Del Vecchio's 13th Valley, and we're about to do Jim Morris's trilogy of Jim Morris's books about Vietnam and guerrilla warfare, and my books, which are coming out. I write a lot because it continues to be cathartic for me, and entertaining. And I am, I think genetically, my Irish kid genes, I'm a storyteller. I'm that kid around the campfire who can keep you enthralled for 45 minutes with a shaggy dog story, just because I'm that kind of storyteller. And so I continue with books. My most recent book is a Korea book called Korean Odyssey, and I think it's probably one of the best I've done since Run Between the Raindrops, which was the Vietnam book. And I wanted, for the longest time, I've always thought Korea was the underrepresented conflict in literature, in movies, in television. And most of those guys, those Korea veterans, trained me before I went to Southeast Asia, and they gave in several instances the training they gave me and the advice they gave me saved my life. And so I've always felt a special kinship with them. And I wanted to do something that said, hey, look, here's Korea. Here's what Korea was about. And so I wrote this story that is now titled Korean Odyssey. It's about one rifle company, one Marine rifle company that has to spool up and throw the rule book out and start grabbing guys and get ready to go to Korea, which they do. And it's been getting terrific reviews. And I'm in the process of doing the 10th in a, I don't know if you're familiar with Jack Reacher and Lee Child and that sort of thing. Well, I have a series that called the Shake Davis File series. And there's 9 books out there now. Everything's available on Amazon, by the way. But so I think the last word in all of this is that despite the fact that I'm backing off a little bit on television and movies and that sort of thing, the agenda is still valid in my view. And there's still more to be said. There's stories to be told that will add to public perception, public insight into who we are and what we are, because there's so much to be celebrated about serving your nation in time of war and in time of peace. As a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, space dude, that I think still remains to be said. And the more we say it, the more we tell it, the more honor we bring to the profession. So it isn't just a 9-to-5 job. You know, this is something that I want to do selflessly. I want to do it in service to the nation, in service to a higher cause. And I celebrate that. And that's what I'm trying to do with the books and the movies and television and so on and so forth. Having said that, all of the books are available online. I don't have them out as ebooks yet because I don't think my voice will carry me through on all of it. But the books are out there. They're available, and I hope people get a chance to read them.